periphery. The golden, muscular appendage wrapped around my neck, flexing and squeezing. There is nothing more panic-inducing than the inability to breathe. It's hardwired into us for survival. When the airway is shut off, our cells scream for oxygen, sending signals for us to fight for our lives, to thrash and flail about, to scramble towards the surface. You can train yourself to bypass these feelings, to meditate past the instinct, and do the opposite of what your body tells you to do, to remain calm. Houdini learned it well. All those deep-sea pearl divers too. I had no such training, and my instinct was to dig into the thing wrapped around my neck with my fingers and pull and try to gain some breathing room. It was a futile task, as it was much stronger than I. The tentacle was as thick as my forearm, and its muscles appeared to run its entire length. I frantically reached into my pocket and came out with a knife. Flipping out the blade, I began to jab towards my neck, a counterintuitive action. The tissue of the beast seemed thick and impenetrable, but the knife was able to punch its hide somewhat. I could feel the slickness of blood along its scaly exterior. It loosened briefly, and I was able to take a deep gulp of fresh air, filling my lungs enough to think clearly. Soon it returned to squeeze with a vengeance. I sawed with my knife, but the thing was wriggling and twisting too much to gain traction. I pulled out my Glock and I placed the muzzle over my left shoulder. Into the thing, I buried it deep into its flesh. I wished that I had the ability to shut my ears, and I winced as I pulled the trigger. There was a deafening blast and the smell of gunpowder. My skin rippled as the gas from the explosion washed over my neck and face. I was sent reeling, tumbling backwards. I landed hard on the floor, the thing loosening its grip on me and wriggling until it went slack. The pressure on my right leg was released, and I looked up to see the yellow thing, gold in the amber light, slither away from me and back into the conservatory region. The creature around my neck hung loose, and I slid my hand between it and my neck and unraveled it. It was a Burmese python, dead but still twitching. It had almost been blown in half by the gunshot, a gaping, bleeding hole by the closest thing that I could consider a neck. The head was bent over like a bendy straw. My neck tingled, and the simple act of breathing never felt so good. The tentacled creature in the fish tank continued to swim around. I listened. A ringing filled my left ear, and there was no new sound waves coming in. With my right ear, I could still hear the dance music from somewhere. It sounded muffled and didn't seem to be coming from the house. I could hear no voices or signs of life from within the house. The tiled room opened up into the foyer of the house. There was more gaudiness here, but it was an impressive gaudiness. The room appeared circular, with a golden globe light fixture hanging above the center of the room, which was marked by a nautical compass painted into the floor. The floor was concrete and stained the color of cola. Curved staircases flanked either side of the circular room, and their railings joined at the top in a small balustrade that overlooked the room. Below that was an entry down a hallway. It seemed like no one had heard the gunshot, and I had the run of the house to myself. I won't bore you with any more of the architectural digest type details, but I found no basements or secret passages. All the while, the music blared on, tempos seldom changing. In a study, I discreetly rifled through some drawers. Sitting on a desk was a check receipt for a very large payment made out to J. McDougal from a company called E-Bliss, $300K to be exact. Not exactly chump change. I was starting to think that this wasn't such a good idea. I wasn't sure what I hoped to find out here. Perhaps I was expecting some sort of smoking gun or weird torture room. I was debating on slinking back into the shadows, but not before figuring out a way to delete the video evidence of my breaking and entering and my python murdering. Downstairs through the hall and towards the back of the house was a kitchen and a dining room. The lights were on, and there were a couple of cold cups of coffee on the kitchen island. Through a bay window, I could see a building off and on a hill about 500 yards from the house. I decided to head that way. Through the back door and onto the patio, the music grew louder. It was now clear that the music was coming from the building in the distance. It was a large barn of sorts, sheet metal on a steel frame. These types of buildings were popular in the region as they were cheaper options for outdoor spaces. It hadn't appeared on the county assessor website when I was scoping out the place, so I surmised that it was recently built. I heard a moan from somewhere nearby and I jumped back into the shadows. I flicked on my flashlight and I shined it through my hand to dim its glow. On a wicker couch lay a girl, a puddle of vomit on the ground beside her. I walked over to her. Her skin was normal, as was her breathing, albeit it was drunk and heavy. She was on her side, head hanging partially off the couch. "Greg," she moaned as I investigated her. "I'll go get him," I said. She shifted her head and her hair to try and look at me, and I noticed that on the inside of her bicep was that old familiar tattoo. It stared at me, and I turned my back to it as I made my way up to the barn on the hill and its club music. My heart tried to keep pace with the beat. I was beginning to feel nervous. What would I do with what I would see in there? What was my plan? Was I walking into a strange ritual where I would become the unwitting participant in a human sacrifice? I couldn't call for backup. I was truly on my own here. It's too late to turn back, I thought. But it was. Yes, it really was. A dead python and video camera footage said otherwise. And these inconveniences were nothing compared to the burning curiosity within me. I pinned my location through the GPS on my phone, and I sent it to Roush with a text. "If I don't call tomorrow, come looking for me here," it read. Aside from a large metal garage-style door at the front, there was only one entrance into the barn, a pair of double doors in the corner. I stood at the threshold, hand on the knob, and service pistol drawn. What can I say about what it felt like to open that door and step into that barn? The multi-sensory, phantasmagorical scene that I stepped into. Words will not do it justice. A TV adaptation reenactment wouldn't either. And not just because there were things there that wouldn't get past the censors. You could recreate the visuals pretty accurately, but you wouldn't be able to nail the true feeling, the ability to look around and walk through it all. Maybe it was being primed by all the paranoia and the oxygen deprivation I had experienced from being strangled by a Burmese python. But as I entered the barn, I was ill prepared for what was to come next and the all-out assault on my senses. I briefly lost touch with reality, and I truly believed that I had stepped into an alternate dimension. I stepped into a room large enough to house a basketball court. The throbbing bass caused my organs to shudder and vibrate in my abdominal cavity, and there was a hazy fog that swirled all around, but it settled heavier on the ground, thick at our ankles. The walls were dense and gelatinous, rough, organic-looking features cascading down in a landslide from the ceiling. Giant stalactites hung and dripped from the ceiling. The texture of the walls and the ceiling glowed fluorescent under unseen lights. The walls, they seemed to breathe. There were people. They swayed and squirmed and writhed. I lost count at 20, and upon realizing that I had entered unnoticed, I holstered my gun. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness and the multicolored spinning lights, I took stock of the activity all around me. Dancers danced, men and women, masked and unmasked. Barely clothed, male and female breast exposed. At the center of the room, there was a raised platform and irregular glowing rods, like alien mushrooms pulsed purple and pink light. People stroked the lights and leaned against them. Glow sticks hung from their necks and they swung them around in blurry arcs. A shirtless, muscular man stood in a pair of boxer briefs, his head hidden inside a large mascot-style panda mask, while he bobbed his body to the beat. A woman in lingerie caressed his body and got down on her knees. Above the platform, a body hung from a thick rope. A shirtless man upside down. His hands were bound behind him, and his right leg was bent behind the outstretched leg that was tied at the ankle to the rope that hung from the ceiling. It was a feat of acrobatics for him to hang so still that way. He had gauze wrapped around his eyes and head, and a woman was at his face kissing him. Off to the side of the dance floor, I saw the shining moon of a giant ass and a figure pounding into it. I realized it was a couple. I made my way through the crowd in a dazed awe. Through the fog, a woman crawled towards me and reached towards my crotch, unzipping my fly and breathing into me. I sidestepped her and disappeared onto the dance floor. I ran smack dab into the back of a wide figure with two heads. The body turned towards me with the face of a man and a woman. They were stuck together somehow, conjoined twins, flesh that melted together at their necks. "Hey, watch where you're going," the man said. "No, you watch where you're going," the woman said. They both cackled and stretched their heads together and kissed. I shook my head and moved on, and a frogman offered me some pills in one hand and a Ziploc bag full of dried mushrooms in the other. I politely declined. But through all of this, there were cracks in the otherworldly, the banality of everyday life that brought things crashing back down to earth. People carried red Solo cups. I caught familiar whiffs of drugs. There was a keg on ice in a trash can, and a line for the bathroom. There was someone leaning against the textured organic wall, looking at their cell phone. I guess they still had service in Dimension X. A couple of wallflowers stood at the side of the room, watching the action. For whatever reason, that did it for me. I realized I was still on Earth amongst all its garden variety weirdos. At the back of the open room, there was a wall. A flat and boring sheetrock wall that extended the width of the room. There were a couple of windows in the wall that overlooked the room and a door. It was unguarded. I entered. A simple hallway illuminated by a fluorescent light. Ceiling tiles and basic wooden trim. A couple of doorways on either side. My hunch told me to open the door on the left at the end of the hallway. Once again, I brandished. I waited a couple of seconds before bursting in. They were surprised. One of them let out a small scream and dropped her glass on the floor. The room was starkly quiet, almost as if it had been soundproofed. I could see them all. Jay, paralegal Lisa, the bartender from the Athenaeum, and some scrawny guy with glasses. Jay's expression turned into one of anger. They were all gathered around an antique card table. A board game and cards and game pieces spread all about. There were drinks on coasters, a cigar smoldering in a crystal ashtray, a flat mirror with a small pile of white powder, a slick cardboard box that said Arkham Horror. Aside from Jay, the others stared at me blankly. Their hands automatically held up. I still had my gun drawn. It didn't seem necessary anymore, so I lowered it. "What are you doing here?" Jay said. I got a noise complaint. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises. I said, "Yeah, right. I'm on 5 acres out here, and they can't hear a thing. Besides, they know we were having a party. Do you have a warrant? You do know it's illegal entry, right? And you realize you're messing with a lawyer." Wait, he's a cop?" the bartender asked. "Yes," Jay told her. I was at a loss for words. I had gambled hard on this, and I had come up with nothing but a bunch of freaks having a costumed orgy in a barn. I wondered if I could slink back out into the crowd, maybe have a beer, show those kids my moonwalk skills, and then be on my way. "Lisa, babe, call the police," Jay said. I doubled down. My chance to get any information was dwindling, and I was about to lose my upper hand. "I am the police," I growled, and I raised my gun again. Nobody moved. "You can't do this," Jay said quietly. "It looks like I am," I said. "Now, what is all this? What are y'all doing here?" "It's a tabletop living card game based off the works of H.P. Lovecraft and features the Cthulhu mythos," the scrawny glasses guy said. "It's really a lot of fun." "Shut up, Greg," Jay said. "You don't have to tell him anything." "What about all that out there? Why are you four all geeking it up in here instead of out there getting your freak on?" I asked. "We're kind of all introverts, you know? This stuff's cool as hell, and we were out there earlier, and you gotta love what Jay's done with the place. We all put in countless hours into making it look just right, and it started with a bang, but after all that, it was just kind of anticlimactic. We had to get back and regroup. We're thinking of taking this show to Burning Man next year. We just had to come back here and, recharge," the bartender said. Greg rubbed the small of her back and smiled at her. "Shut up, shut up, shut up," said Jay as he closed his eyes and rubbed his temples in annoyance. "What about you, Lisa?" I said, and I looked at her. She had tried to keep a detached cool, but her bottom lip was shaking a little. "F you, pig," she said and stared at me angrily. It was a pretty good front. "So, you all meet up periodically and play this game and drink and party and have a good time. And you really dig this Lisa chick, don't you, Jay? So much so that you've kind of melded her whole spooky aesthetic with your office and your new digs and this whole man cave you've got out here. I mean, look at you. You look like Edgar Allan Poe's douchebag cousin." It was all true. He was sporting a slim, dark coat and a gray vest, and was also wearing an elegant neckerchief. Edgar Allan Bro, I thought. But too late to work it into my spiel. No one talked, so I continued. "So, I was thinking something was rotten when I visited your firm, but I couldn't quite place my finger on it. Maybe Dennis did, and maybe you all offed him. Maybe he caught you and the paralegal and was going to tell your wife. And what's with all the tattoos? Are you all in some kind of cult? Is there more to this than meets the eye?" "Don't tell him anything, just let him keep blabbing on," Jay said. Then he looked directly at me. "I'm going to give you a couple of more minutes before I call the station. We were having a nice night until you showed up, and I don't want to cancel the party on account of your shenanigans." "The tattoos," Lisa started in a condescending tone, "are just a cool little design for our local cult chapter. And by cult, I mean a group of us that get together and play board games with paranormal themes. You are an absolute paranoid dumbass." She picked up her cell phone and dialed a number. "Yes, I would like to report a man claiming to be a police officer. He's by himself and he has a gun. He says his name is..." She looked up at me. "What was your name again?" She had called my bluff. There was nothing else I could do. I turned to the scrawny guy. "Hey Greg, there's a drunk gal up by the patio. You might want to check on her. Bring her a glass of water," I said, and I stepped out the door. I went back out through the party and through the door. I always ended up leaving these things early. It seemed like I had only delayed the inevitable. I was called into Captain Hobbs' office the next day. He was fuming. I could tell by the color of his face. He would have to open a valve soon, or else he would blow a gasket. An engorged forehead vein snaked across his face. "Have a seat," he said. I sat, and he drummed his fingers on the desk, then leaned back in his chair and threaded them together over his gut. He seemed to be counting his breaths, holding the anger in. I knew what was coming. A film of dread began to coat my stomach. "Are you out of your mind? An illegal entry? Pulling your weapon on civilians without cause? There's been a formal complaint filed on that. They've got you on camera. The DA is feeling the pressure to press formal charges on you. And I haven't even mentioned the fact that you discharged your weapon within the home, killing a pet." He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" "Yeah, those pythons are a real nuisance in Florida. They've spread all over, an invasive species. As far as I was concerned, I was just doing the neighborhood a favor. Well, you're being placed on administrative leave while we have an internal investigation. With pay. I think I can work the DA to hold off pressing charges. He knows you've been a loyal public servant. If we get another lawsuit, I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep you on due to liability reasons. Our liability insurance is already sky high after that little Officer Hayes episode last year. The insurance company may require termination to keep the rates steady. I didn't have anything to say. The news was expected, but I suddenly didn't know what to do with myself. I felt numb. You're dismissed. You'll need to hand in your badge and service pistol. We'll be in touch, the chief said. I waited through night after drunken night. I was eating less food than ever. I awoke every morning with a burning in my stomach and an ache in my head. I began to take little eye-openers, a couple of shots with Pepto and coffee so that I could get through the morning. I choked down vitamins so that I wouldn't develop some sort of deficiency. I went out as little as I could. I spoke to real people even less. Roush had tried to call me a couple of times, but I ignored his calls. I didn't hear anything from the station for those first 3 weeks. I ignored the headlines in the papers. I considered treatment. The drinking had snuck up on me. First, a couple of nights of drunken revelry after my reprimand and forced leave, and then a resulting drunk that had lasted a week. For the first time in my life, I felt like I couldn't function the following day without a few drinks as soon as I woke up. I was sluggish and lethargic, not thinking clearly, forgetting things. I slept a lot. Hours disappeared without significance, and sometimes I awoke without knowing where I was. I would find strange bruises and cuts and scrapes from falls that I didn't remember taking. I quit shaving. I quit bathing. I wore the same clothes for weeks at a time. I zoned out on bad TV and I streamed endless YouTube videos. They had channels for everything. No shortages of fake human connections out there to talk to me. Sometimes I talked back. I quit answering my phone. It went days without being turned on. I began to roam the streets in the mid-afternoons. Up and down the sidewalks I went. People avoided eye contact with me and gave me a wide berth as they passed. They eyed me suspiciously from their porches and peeked out their curtains as I stumbled up the streets. And then, one fateful Saturday, I went back to where it all started. Dennis's old neighborhood. I traced the old creek for a while, went into the tunnels where I had found Rudy Knowles, the crazy clown. I took a couple of photos with my cell phone. I sat and drank off a pint bottle for a bit. Then I roamed back towards Dennis's old house. There was a sign that read estate sale, and the address was familiar. Amy and Dennis Burrows' old house was being gutted and sold. A real estate sign in the front yard read sold, contract pending. There were tables in the garage full of books and knickknacks and men's clothes. I wandered inside. Browsers milled about and a lady in a pantsuit oversaw everything. Couches and mirrors and vases and armchairs and beds and rugs were arranged around the starkly barren house. I saw the dining room table where I had sat with Amy about 2 years ago. It had a sold sticker on it. I went back into the garage and pursued the tables. I encountered a variety of Stephen King and John Grisham and law books and other assorted authors. There was a stack of sci-fi and horror fare. Principles of Time and Stranger in a Strange Land and Replay and A Brief History of Time and a collection of short stories by our old buddy H.P. Lovecraft. There was a cardboard box of electronics, black cords sticking out. I dug through it and found an old alarm clock, a Microsoft Zune, and a black laptop. The laptop wasn't the one that we had requisitioned before. I tossed a few books into the box and I carried it to the boss lady running the estate sale. And I bought it, and I was on my way. I had never been so excited by a box of junk before. At the apartment, there was bad news. There was a letter from the station informing me to contact them immediately, saying that they had been trying to contact me for the past 2 weeks to no avail. I didn't need to call the station to learn the news, but I did anyways. I needed to find out how long my benefits would last, and when my last paycheck would be available, and when I could come clean out my desk. A long line of losses and letdowns throughout my adult life. Well, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. I had already been in a bad place, teetering on the edge of some devastating precipice. This was the final blow. My job had been the last bastion of the fortress protecting my ego and self, and now it was all gone. The people I talked to throughout most of my recent years had been at the job, and I was used to the routine of seeing them. I thought of calling Roush or Briggs, but I didn't want them to see me in the sorry state that I now found myself. I found that if I just stayed in my apartment alone, I drank more. So, during the day, I took to the streets. I took to donning my trench coat on those cold January days. So many of them were overcast and drizzly. When there was no precipitation, the sun refused to show itself, instead hiding under sheets of gray clouds. On these walks, I nursed a half pint throughout the day, but sometimes just a can of Steel Reserve instead. I had vague plans of tapering down and slowly weaning off completely, but this came in fits and starts, and I knew that I was past the point of stopping cold turkey. The threat of seizures due to withdrawals was looming large. I walked miles upon miles, talking to myself every now and then. Sometimes I would pick up a gas station hot dog, my only real nourishment for days. I was losing weight, looking sickly. I began to see and hear things. I started seeing the tall, gray man again. He always stood looking at me from afar, distances too far for me to fear. But then he started talking to me, a voice directly in my ear, in a language and tongue I didn't even understand. He only served as a point of interest and never approached me, never got close enough for me to make out any other defining features. I wondered if he had ever really been real. I found myself in Dennis's old neighborhood often, just wandering the sidewalks in broad daylight. I even traced the entire tunnel system one day, an impressive feat of civil engineering that stretched under a giant complex for over a mile. But there was nothing but graffiti and the smell of damp and decay. And then one day, I saw him, watching me. This was no illusion. He was there, and I suddenly remembered Trenchy. He had on his trench coat and another spare coat that he had draped over his head like an old woman with a scarf. He was a block and a half away, staring at me from behind a telephone pole. I couldn't make out his face. His beard and hair were very long and disheveled, and he had the other coat pulled over his head. When I turned to get a better look, he appeared to play dumb or crazy and began to walk a little circle around the telephone pole. I got closer. He took off in a dead sprint away from me. The chase began. The guy was surprisingly fast. My gut ached and churned, and vomit spurted out of me as I ran. I didn't even stop. That helped. He cut down an alley. I followed. Through yards and over hedges and down streets, I followed him. We ran across the open space of a soccer field. The dead grass, the gray sky, the middle school nearby, kids at recess. He was going straight for the fence of the playground, and I was at his heels as he fell over the other side. The kids parted and screamed as us two crazed individuals trampled through their playground. I saw flashes of their scared and bewildered faces as I passed. "Mrs. Myers, Mrs. Myers!" a little girl screamed. "Jamie, get Coach Sutton and the principal. Everybody get back." I gained on him enough near the basketball court, and I took a flying tackle towards him, and we tumbled to the ground together. I wrestled around with him on the ground. He smelled awful, and I choked on his stench. I was able to get wrapped up in his loosed coat and bury my knees into his back as he lay face down. "It's okay, everyone, I'm the police," I said, looking around. A crowd had formed a safe distance away. It was quiet as they stared in shock and awe. I could hear sirens in the distance. "He's the key to all of this," I shouted to them in a cracking voice. "You'll see." He wriggled under my knees. I grabbed his shoulder so that I could roll him over onto his back and get a real good look. The moment of truth. His face looked into mine.